I transmitted the 14 harmonic distress cry at 0412, standard expansion cycle reckoning, and for 11 minutes, I believed it would save us. I want to be precise about that. I was not panicked when I sent it. I was not desperate in any way the Vreth Communion would recognize as weakness. I was performing the oldest survival protocol in our species' long memory, the signal that says, in 14 layered tones simultaneously, we are struck, we are bleeding, we need the weight of the communion to stand beside us. I had trained for that moment for 9 cycles. My harmonics were clean. My amplitude was correct. The signal went out across 14 carrier frequencies, at the precise phase stagger the communion's transit response doctrine required for fastest intercept. I did everything right. That is what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. The contact appeared on our lateral array at 0347, 31 minutes before I transmitted. It appeared, and the word is exact. It did not emerge from transit, did not decloak, did not drift into range from a concealed drift corridor. Our full sensor blanket registered nothing, and then it registered the ship, and there was no interval between those two states. One sweep, void. Next sweep, hull. The hull was 1,800 meters in its longest dimension. Wedge prow configuration. 12 primary weapons housings on the dorsal line, 4 lateral clusters, 2 ventral emplacements. Hull plating mismatched in color and surface texture, as though many different repair episodes had been conducted by many different hands over a long service life, though the hull shape and system signature read as new construction, rather than aged hull. That contradiction made no sense to me at the time. I logged it as sensor artifact and moved on. I searched the archive while Fleet Caller Amath Vressen, my counterpart at the secondary communion relay, pulled up the weapons classification tables. The archive, the Vreth Communion's complete record of all spacefaring hull types encountered in 900 years of expansion, returned no match, not a partial match, not a match pending confirmation, the archive said, in the flat administrative tone it uses for null returns, that no hull matching this configuration existed in any scanned record. The entry field was blank. No archive entry, I reported to Commander Oseth Fral. The commander was merged half deep into the immaculate body of the 7th merger. Its command nerve cluster, her secondary neural threads distributed across the flagship's primary sense organs, reading the ship's own sensory input directly. The immaculate body was our newest hull, 6 months grown from the Communion's largest vat complex, 6,200 meters of living armor and merged biological matrix, still rich with growth hormone and the immune confidence of youth. She had never been struck. She had never been boarded. No enemy had pressed against her outer membrane and found it anything but unyielding. She was the finest warship the Communion had ever fielded, and in her commander's merged perception, she was calm, massive, and certain. Unknown configuration, Commander Oseth Fral said. Origin? None established, no transit signature, no drift corridor of record. It was not there, and then it was. Mass? Approximately 4.2 million standard units. We are 140 million standard units fully merged. Weapons potential? Classification unknown. Weapons housings are exterior mounted. Not biological integration. Not grown. Manufactured. Fixed mount construction. We have no output rating for them. There was a pause. I was aware of the commander's attention moving through the immaculate body. Sense tissue. She was reading the contact directly through the ship, tasting its electromagnetic output with the hull's own sensor cilia. Around me, the command choir's various stations maintained their quiet biological hum, nutrient circulation, growth node monitoring, communion relay harmonics cycling at idle frequency. One hull, the commander said at last. No support ships, no fleet signature trailing in transit. Just one hull. Confirmed. One hull. And no archive entry. Confirmed. She was quiet for 3 more seconds. Then, it is a scout, or a lost vessel, or a surveying hull running outside its doctrine. There is no archive entry, because this configuration is new. Earth has recently produced it, and we have not yet cataloged it. This is a first contact geometry, not a combat geometry. She paused again. Signal it. Standard Communion First Encounter Protocol. We are fleet strength here. 8 hulls, including the immaculate body. Whatever it is, it will respond to our scale. I transmitted the standard encounter signal. Every communion hull in the expansion corridor, and there were many who had done this work, knew what that signal produced. A hesitation, a transponder handshake, sometimes a message, always an acknowledgement that the contacted vessel understood it was in the presence of force that was not worth provoking. The contact did not respond. Second transmission, the commander said. I sent it. The contact held its course, its velocity unchanged. I noted the velocity precisely, 0.73% of light speed, which was fast for a vessel its mass. Not impossibly so, but the ratio was wrong for anything our weapons classification tables described in the non-communion catalog. Most manufactured vessels that massed at 4.2 million standard units moved at half that rate. The discrepancy between mass and velocity was another item I had logged as probable sensor artifact. I was logging a great many things as sensor artifact that morning. At 0401, the contact altered course. Not a large alteration, 4 degrees relative to its previous heading, but the new heading pointed directly at the immaculate body. I reported this. It has chosen, Commander Vreth said, and there was something in her merge tone, a quality I had not heard from her before in 9 cycles of serving under her, that was not fear and not quite its absence. Prepare receiving nodes. If it is a boarding attempt, we will consume it. The Vreth Communion's standard engagement response was biological in nature. Our hull's outer membrane, when stimulated, could extend absorption tendrils at significant velocity. Contact with an enemy hull meant tendrils working into gaps, membrane-to-membrane pressure, eventual incorporation. The process was unpleasant for the absorbed. It was also, against most hull types we had encountered, entirely reliable. The immaculate body had absorption capacity rated for hulls up to 12,000 meters. A 1,800-meter manufactured vessel would be consumed in minutes. So Commander Vreth was calm when she ordered receiving nodes prepared. She was performing, with great professionalism, the standard response to an unknown hull approaching on an attack heading. She had done this 3 times in her career, against 3 different species warships, and all 3 outcomes had been the same. The ship approached, the membrane met it. The ship became part of the Communion's living fleet. At 0408, the contact crossed what our tactical membrane registered as its own effective weapons range. This determination was made by the immaculate body herself through her own tactical nerve cluster, and it was based on the weapons classification tables for manufactured hull types, exterior fixed mount construction, approximate output ratings, derived from size and power signature modeling. According to those tables, the contact's weapons would become effective at 2,400 kilometers. We were at 14,000 kilometers. We had time. At 0409, 11 seconds after our own effective weapons range estimate, placed the contact outside engagement threshold. The contact fired. I know the weapons designation now. I did not know it at the time. The Wardenship of Sol calls them kinetic lances, a term that understates the engineering involved, the way you might describe a star as warm. 8 projectiles launched from the dorsal battery, at a velocity I will record accurately here, even knowing it will seem wrong. 4.1% of light speed. Not the projectile velocity at launch, the velocity at impact, achieved through a combination of rail-driven initial acceleration and onboard propulsion across the 14,000-kilometer gap. They crossed that gap in 11.3 seconds. The first 3 struck the immaculate body as primary growth nodes. I have tried to describe this in terms that convey what it meant for a living ship. The growth nodes are the biological equivalent of a spinal column, combined with a central nervous system, combined with the organ that controls immune response and wound healing. When the first lance hit the forward growth node, the immaculate body screamed. Not metaphorically, the Vreth Communion's ships are alive, and when they are struck in a critical organ, they respond as living things respond, with pain, with the immediate biological flooding of distress chemistry, with an uncontrolled neural cascade that sent every merged crew member spasming at their integration points. I fell sideways from my communion relay station. My secondary neural threads, integrated with the ship's harmonic systems, were flooded with the ship's pain signal before the integration circuit could isolate. I experienced, for approximately 1.4 seconds, what the immaculate body was experiencing, a three-point breach of her deepest biological architecture, growth chemistry spilling into void, the immune system's frantic attempt to seal damage moving at the speed of biological processes rather than the speed of what had hit her. The second volley hit before the first wounds had sealed. The lances 2 and 3 had struck the growth nodes. Lances 4 through 8 struck the lateral membrane across the hull's midsection, the region that housed the absorption tendril musculature, the systems we had been preparing to use against the contact. The lateral membrane ruptures were not as biologically catastrophic as the growth node strikes, but they eliminated our absorption capability. The tendrils we had been preparing, the Communion's primary weapon against hull-to-hull engagement, were severed at the root clusters. The immaculate body could not absorb the contact. She could barely move. 7 of our 8 escort hulls in the expansion corridor responded. They moved toward the contact at full tactical thrust, which was not slow. The Communion's mid-class warbodies were capable of significant acceleration. 3 of them reached the contact at 0410. I watched this from the Communion relay station, where I had returned to my integration point, despite the residual pain signal still cycling through the ship's harmonics. I watched through the immaculate body, his external sense cilia, which were still partially functional in the sections away from the wound sites. The contact, the human warship I would later learn was called the WSN Pale Erasure, engaged the 3 approaching Communion hulls without any change in its course or velocity. It did not close to absorption range. It did not maneuver defensively. It fired from the same range at which it had struck us, 14,000 kilometers, using the same weapons. 6 seconds after our escort hulls entered that range, 2 of them were dead. Their biology had been struck repeatedly in critical regions: growth nodes, neural clusters, the vascular systems that circulated their life chemistry, and the damage was not the kind that living things could sustain. The third escort hull was alive but burning, losing atmosphere and fluid, at a rate that meant it would not be alive for long. The Pale Erasure continued on its original course. "Report status," Commander Oseth Vral said. Her merged voice had a quality I had never heard from her. She was still integrated with the immaculate body, still receiving the ship's sensory input, and the ship's sensory input was a biological scream. Growth nodes 1 and 3 confirmed destroyed. Node 2 compromised at 60%. Absorption tendril musculature severed across lateral sections B through F. 3 escort hulls combat effective. 2 hulls destroyed. 1 hull critically damaged and losing fluid. I paused. The contact is still inbound. Weapons return? Our standard membrane contact emitters are functional, but the contact is not closing to membrane range. It is maintaining its 14,000 kilometer standoff and firing from there. Silence. The immaculate body throbbed with pain chemistry. "It is fighting at a range outside our engagement envelope," the commander said. "Yes. Our weapons are not effective at that range." Confirmed. She was very still in her integration point. I watched the contact on the sensor cilia feed, this 1,800-meter vessel that the archive contained no record of, moving through the expansion corridor with a certainty that was not aggressive in any theatrical sense. It did not accelerate toward us dramatically, did not posture, did not broadcast any signal of triumph or announcement. It simply moved and struck, at a range our biology had never required us to respect before. "Transmit the distress cry," Commander Oseth Vral said. "All 14 harmonics, full amplitude. We need the Communion's weight here." I transmitted it. The Vreth Communion's 14 harmonic distress cry is the product of 900 years of refinement. It is not a simple signal. It is a biological and electromagnetic compound that carries, in its layering and phase stagger, not just the message of distress, but the location, the severity, the nature of the engagement, and the specific identity of the transmitting vessel. Any Communion ship within transit range receives it as both a radio signal and, if close enough, a resonance through the Communion substrate. the distributed biological network that connects all Communion fleets across space. It is the loudest thing our species knows how to say. It means, we are here, and we are hurt, and we need you. I transmitted it at 0412. I was not panicked, I was precise. The first reinforcement hull transited in at 0414. Transit entry produces a signature, a specific electromagnetic pattern as a vessel pushes through the boundary between transit space and normal space. It is brief, approximately 0.8 seconds in duration, and it occurs at a fixed point, defined by the vessel's approach angle in transit space. Every transit has this signature. It is unavoidable. It is also, in every engagement the Communion had ever recorded, tactically irrelevant. Transit in was a moment of vulnerability, yes, during the 0.8 seconds of boundary crossing, but no weapon we had ever faced could target that 0.8 second window reliably enough to make it a tactical consideration. The WSN Pale Erasure struck the first reinforcement hull 0.4 seconds into its transit. The lance had already been fired when the hull was still crossing the boundary. The Pale Erasure had known, to within the tolerance of its weapon's accuracy, at 14,000 kilometers, where and when the reinforcement hull would emerge. It had solved that geometry before the hull appeared. It had fired into the emerging space. The reinforcement hull was dead before it had fully entered normal space. I stared at my sensor cilia feed and did not understand what I was seeing. The distress cry had gone out at 0412. The reinforcement hull had responded. Transit from the nearest response position took approximately 90 seconds, and it was dead at 0414. Report, the commander said. First reinforcement hull, transit intercept. Struck during boundary crossing. Hull is gone. A pause. The immaculate body trembled with a pain spasm as a secondary growth node failure propagated through her biology. It tracked the transit signature, the commander said. It appears so. How precisely? I ran the numbers. The projectile was launched 2.3 seconds before transit emergence. It was aimed at the emergence point with an accuracy of approximately 180 meters lateral deviation at impact, at the range and velocity involved. I stopped. Say it, the commander said. It had the emergence point to within 180 meters before the hull emerged. It was not reacting to the transit signature. It had predicted the emergence point in advance. The only thing the Pale Erasure could have used to predict the emergence point was the harmonic content of the distress cry itself. The 14 harmonic distress signal contained, in its phase structure, the location and identity of the transmitting vessel. A vessel responding to the signal would transit in on an approach vector, determined by its own starting position and the distress location, a geometry that could be calculated if you knew where the distress signal had originated. The Pale Erasure was using our distress cry as a transit intercept targeting system. I understood this at 0416. I understood it completely, in the full biological cognitive sense, not as an abstract tactical problem, but as a physical sensation, because my neural threads were still partially integrated with the immaculate body. And what I was feeling through those threads was the ship's pain layered under my own cognitive shock, and the two things together had a quality I do not have adequate words for. The 14 harmonic distress cry had been designed by the Communion's signal architects across 11 generations of refinement. Its complexity was its security. The layered phase stagger that encoded location and vessel identity was considered, by every analyst who had ever reviewed the protocol, to be computationally inaccessible to any non-Communion species. Too many interdependent variables, too tight a timing window. Those analysts had been correct about every species the Communion had catalogued. Every species in the archive with no entry for the Pale Erasure. I did not stop the signal. I should explain this. I know how it reads now, in retrospect, with full knowledge of what followed. I did not stop the signal, because stopping the signal would have meant acknowledging, to Commander Oseth Vral, to the command choir, to the Communion's tactical record, that the 14 harmonic distress cry, the 900-year-old survival protocol, was killing us. And I could not quite do that in the 0414 to 0416 window, in the middle of the engagement, with the 0 immaculate body. Screaming, and the pale erasure. Still closing. I ran the calculation again. I checked it against the signal theory. I confirmed the result. The second reinforcement hull transited in at 0417. The pale erasure struck it at 0417.3 seconds. The third reinforcement hull transited at 0419. Pale erasure struck it at 0419.2 seconds. Stop the signal, I said at 0420. What? Commander Vreth Communion said. Stop the distress signal. The human warship is using our harmonic phase structure to calculate reinforcement transit coordinates. Every hull that answers the call gives it a new targeting solution. We are killing our reinforcements. I transmitted the calculation to the commander's integration point directly, bypassing verbal report, pushing the mathematical model through our neural thread connection. I felt her receive it. I felt, in some attenuated biological transfer sense, what she felt when she understood. She ordered the signal stopped at 0421, but at 0421, the signal had been cycling for 9 minutes. The harmonic distress cry, once transmitted, does not simply stop when the source goes silent. It carries in the communion substrate, that distributed biological network. Ships in transit, already responding, carry the signal's phase information in their navigation cores. They are already oriented to the distress location. They are already committed to their transit approach vectors. Stopping the signal source does not deorient a ship already in transit. 6 more reinforcement hulls transited in the window between 0421 and 0427. The pale erasure killed all 6. The pale erasure was doing something during this period that I want to describe carefully because I believe it is important. It was not expending reckless fire. It was not wasting ordnance in a frenzy. It was methodical. Each transit intercept solution was calculated and executed with a precision that the Communion's tactical archive, which I was searching frantically throughout this period, had no category for. The weapon solutions it was running would have required, at minimum, a targeting system capable of integrating the harmonic distress signal's phase data in real time, computing an approach vector for each responding vessel, solving the transit emergence point geometry for that vector, leading the target by the appropriate distance for the kinetic lance flight time, and firing with an accuracy that allowed for drift and tactical variance. All of this, for each target, in under 2 seconds. I found one entry in the archive, filed by a Communion signals analyst 220 years prior, that touched on the theoretical possibility of using distress harmonics as targeting data. The entry concluded that the calculation was theoretically achievable, but practically impossible for any species currently in the Communion's catalog, given the processing requirements. The entry had been reviewed twice, both times marked theoretical, no tactical application, and filed under historical curiosities. At 0429, Commander Vreth Communion gave the order to move the surviving escort hulls out of the expansion corridor. There were 4 of them still combat effective. There was nothing they could do at the range the pale erasure was engaging from, and attempting to close that range had produced the deaths of 2 of our 8 original escorts. The order was the correct one, tactically. It was also the most painful order I have heard a Communion commander give, not because of its content, but because of its sound, the quality of the merged voice she used to issue it, which was the voice of a commander who has understood that the engagement is over, and has been over, and that what remains is only determining the final cost. The cost was still accumulating. At 0431, the pale erasure fired 4 lances at the immaculate body. Directly. Not a transit intercept solution. A direct engagement shot at our hull. 2 struck the secondary growth node cluster on the ventral surface. 1 struck the neural relay ganglion that controlled the ship's primary drive tissue. 1 missed. The immaculate body went into biological shock. I am not using that term loosely. The Vreth Communion's living ships can experience systemic biological shock, a cascade failure of the homeostatic chemistry that maintains function across the ship's entire organic architecture. When a critical neural relay is struck, the cascade triggers. The ship does not die immediately. It begins a process of managed biological failure, the organism's last systems attempting to prioritize what can be preserved. Immaculate body. The finest warship the Communion had ever produced, 6 months old, still carrying her growth richness, entered that process at 0431. I remained integrated. My neural threads were still joined to the ship's harmonic systems. What I experienced through those threads for the next 13 minutes is not something I can fully translate into terms that non-integrated beings would find meaningful. There was pain, yes. There was the biological equivalent of fear, the body's own distress chemistry, running without the psychological control that conscious beings impose on it. There was also something else, a quality in the ship's dying neural signal that I have since spent considerable effort trying to categorize, and have not been able to. This immaculate body was 6,200 meters of living tissue, the most complex biological system the Communion had ever grown, and she was ending. And through my neural threads I was present for that ending, in a way that was not academic. At 0434, the additional reinforcement fleet arrived. Not individual hulls in staggered transit. A fleet, 19 hulls, responding to the distress cry's earlier transmission, as a coordinated formation, transiting in on staggered vectors across a 40-second window. They were the Communion's second echelon response force for the expansion corridor. Heavier hulls, more experienced commanders, the kind of weight Commander Oseth Vral had been calling for when she ordered the signal transmitted. Pale Erasure. Killed 4 of them during transit. 15 arrived combat effective. Against 15 combat effective Communion hulls, the Pale Erasure, for the first time in the 47-minute engagement, did not have the geometry entirely to itself. The second echelon fleet had been briefed on the transit intercept targeting as they transited. The Communion's Communion substrate allows real-time information transfer to vessels in transit. They scattered their emergence points using variance protocols. Pale Erasure had firing solutions for the expected emergence vectors. The variance protocols moved 4 of the 15 hulls outside those solutions. 4 hulls reached normal space unkilled. The Pale Erasure faced, for the first time, warships that had transited safely and were accelerating toward engagement range. It killed 2 more of them at long range before they closed. It killed 1 more as it was achieving absorption tendril deployment range. The remaining hull managed to press membrane contact and deploy tendrils. Against a hull the Communion had biological data on, a hull that existed in the archive, the tendril-to-hull interface would have been straightforward. The archive contains absorption data for every hull material type the Communion has encountered. Their resistance to tendril penetration, their structural failure points, the sequence for working through outer plating to reach internal systems. That data drives the tendril guidance nerves. The archive contained no data on the WSN Pale Erasure hull material. The tendril guidance nerves, lacking data, defaulted to general contact protocol, the approach used for entirely novel hull types, which involves a broader, slower penetration sequence, while the guidance system builds a real-time model of the new material. This sequence is approximately 4.6 times slower than archive-guided penetration. The Pale Erasure fired point defense weapons during the 14 seconds the tendril was working through its outer plating. It severed 11 of the 12 primary tendril clusters before the 12th penetrated outer plating and reached internal structure. At that point, the Pale Erasure withdrew from membrane contact at a velocity our tendril recovery systems could not match. The 12th tendril cluster was severed at the root. The hull that had pressed contact was now combat degraded, its tendril musculature 90% destroyed. The Pale Erasure killed it with a single lance volley at 0441. At 0443, the remaining 11 second echelon hulls, the ones that had transited safely, were positioned across the engagement space in a formation that the Communion's doctrine calls the enclosure. Multiple approach vectors, absorption tendrils prepared, attempting to saturate the target's point defense by forcing it to engage multiple simultaneous membrane contact attempts. The Pale Erasure spent 17 seconds engaging this formation. Of the 11 hulls, 8 were destroyed outright. 2 were critically damaged and combat effective. One hull, out of 31 that had engaged or been struck, achieved membrane contact that held long enough to begin meaningful penetration of the pale erasure. Was outer plating. Pale erasure. Withdrew again at 0445. It did not accelerate away dramatically. It did not broadcast any signal. It simply changed course. A 4-degree heading adjustment. The same magnitude of course change it had made at 0401 when it first oriented toward the immaculate body, and returned to something close to its original heading through the expansion corridor. I watched it go. I was still integrated with the immaculate body, and the immaculate body was still dying. The pace of her dying had become easier to be present for, not because it was less severe, but because the acute phase had passed, and what remained was a slower process, a gradual quieting of systems, rather than the violent cascade of the initial shock. I want to be honest about this. Being present with her as she died was not something I could have endured in the form it took in those first minutes after the neural relay strike. In those minutes, it had been overwhelming. By 0445, it had become something I could sustain. I stayed integrated because I could not decide to disengage. Something in the communion substrate, in the network of mutual recognition that connects crew and ship in the Vreth Communion's deepest biology, made leaving feel wrong in a way I could not override with tactical reasoning. At 0447, Commander Osith Vral disengaged from her integration point. She had been present with the ship longer than I had. She was the commander, and her integration was deeper, and what that meant for her experience of the immaculate body. And dying I do not know, because she has not described it, and I have not asked. She emerged from her station with the particular quality of stillness that follows deep integration, and in circumstances like these, not the clean stillness of a planned disengagement, but the abrupt quiet of severance, the neural thread withdrawal from a system that was failing. She stood in the command nerve chamber and looked at the sensor cilia feed for 40 seconds without speaking. 31 hulls, she said finally. 31 confirmed destroyed, I said. 2 additional hulls critically damaged and without combat capability. The immaculate body is in systemic biological failure. Estimated time to total biological shutdown, 11 to 14 hours. I paused. The pale erasure is withdrawing on its original approach heading. No indication of pursuit posture. It appears to be continuing through the expansion corridor. It did not stay. No. It did not pursue the surviving escort hulls. No. It did not attempt to hold the engagement space. She said it as though she were cataloging items from a list she had not been given in advance, but was constructing in real time from what she had observed. It came in, it engaged, and now it is leaving. Yes, on the same heading it arrived on, as though we were a waypoint. I had not phrased it that way. I had not been able to bring myself to phrase it that way, but that was the accurate description of what the pale erasure whose behavior indicated. It had entered the expansion corridor on a heading. We had been in the expansion corridor on that heading. It had engaged and destroyed 31 of our hulls and damaged our flagship past recovery, and then it had continued, at close to its original velocity, on close to its original heading, as though it had a destination, and we had been on the way to it. Where does that heading go? Commander Osith Vral asked. Expansion Corridor 7 leads to the Vreth Consolidation Sphere at Nexus Von, I said. The first major communion habitat cluster inside our established expansion boundary. She looked at the feed for another long moment. What is its transit capacity? She asked. Can it transit? The archive contains no data on the pale erasure. His transit capability. I said this and heard, in saying it, everything the absence of that information meant. The archive contained no data on the hull shape, the weapons output, the hull material, the targeting capability, the tactical doctrine, or now the transit capability of the vessel that had just killed 31 of our hulls and was continuing through our expansion corridor. The Wardenship of Saul's vessels are transit capable as a general rule. If the pale erasure is standard Wardenship construction, it is transit capable. Then file the alert to Nexus Van. Already transmitting. She turned away from the sensor cilia feed. She looked at me. and I realized that in 9 cycles of working under her, I had rarely seen her look at me with full attention. She was usually partially merged, partially distributed into the ship's systems, her attention split between the human cognitive and the biological communion layer. Now she was fully present, fully in her own nervous system, entirely there in the room with me. "The distress signal," she said. "It used the distress signal." "Yes. The 14 harmonics. The phase structure that encodes our location. It calculated transit approach vectors from the phase data and killed each hull as it emerged." "Yes. How long would a species need to develop that capability? To build a targeting system that can process the harmonic phase data, solve the transit emergence geometry, and fire with that accuracy in that window?" I did not want to answer this question, because I did not want to say out loud what the answer implied. But I said it. The capability is theoretically achievable. A communion signals analyst filed a theoretical note 220 years ago. The assessment at the time was that no species in our current catalog had the processing infrastructure to implement it practically. I paused. The pale erasure. His targeting system implemented it in under 2 seconds per transit, across 47 minutes of continuous engagement, without apparent degradation in accuracy. And we have no archive entry for the pale erasure. No. Which means we have never encountered a hull of this class before. Correct. Which means we do not know how many of them exist. I said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The immaculate body produced a long, low harmonic through her dying neural tissue. Not a signal, not a transmission, just the sound of a biological system in systemic failure. The body's own acoustics as things went quiet. I was still integrated. I heard it through my neural threads, and through the air in the command nerve chamber simultaneously. The 2 versions were not identical. The version through the air was attenuated, architectural, the building's echo of a sound produced deep in its structure. The version through the neural threads was immediate and intimate, and I will not try to describe it further. "The 14 harmonic distress cry," Commander Oseth Vral said. "It has been the Communion's primary survival protocol for 900 years. Every fleet uses it. Every fleet knows it. Every ship carries it, as the first response to critical damage." Yes. And the pale erasure has that frequency now. The phase structure, the encoding. It received a clean transmission for 9 minutes before I stopped the signal. Yes, it has the full harmonic structure. Any vessel that transmits the 14 harmonic distress cry in the pale erasure range will give it the same targeting data we gave it. She stood very still. "File the signal breach report to the Communion High Communion," I said. "They need to know the distress harmonic is compromised." "I know." She did not move for another several seconds. "Prepare the full engagement record for transmission. All sensor cilia data. All weapons exchange data. All transit intercept solutions. The targeting model. The archive null return for the pale erasure. Hull class." She paused. "The full 9 minutes of the harmonic transmission they received." "Understood." "And the hull count?" 31, I said. 31, she said. "And the pale erasure withdrew intact, with minor hull penetration from the tendril contact, no critical damage confirmed." She made a sound that I had not heard from a Communion commander before. It was not despair in the way individual fear is despair. It was more specific than that. A sound produced by someone who has understood something they will not be able to unlearn, who has calculated the implications of what they have understood, and who has found the implications unacceptable, but is unable to reject them. The pale erasure was intact. It was continuing through Corridor 7. We did not know how many vessels of its class the Wardenship had built. We did not know what else it could do that our archive had no entry for. We knew that the signal the Communion had used to call for help for 900 years was now a targeting beacon for at least one human warship, and we did not know how many others had received the same frequency in the 9 minutes of transmission. We knew that what the pale erasure had done to 31 hulls in 47 minutes, it had done methodically, without urgency, on its way to somewhere else. "Is the immaculate body capable of transit?" Commander Oseth Vral asked. "The drive tissue is destroyed." "No." "Then we stay with her." "Yes." Immaculate body. Continued her slow dying through the rest of the expansion cycle. Her harmonics quieted over the following hours in a pattern I recognize now, having integrated with dying ships twice more since that day, as the pattern of a living system concluding. Not abruptly, gradually, the way light fades at end of day. Not a single moment of darkness but an accumulation of dimming until there is no more light to measure. Commander Oseth Vral did not reintegrate. She stood in the command nerve chamber for most of it. I stayed at my relay station, partially integrated, present with the ship until the neural threads returned nothing. The final harmonic, the immaculate body, produced, in the 4th hour after the engagement, was at a frequency too low for unassisted biological hearing. I received it through my integration threads, and then there was nothing. Outside, in the expansion corridor, the pale erasure. These emissions trace was long gone. We filed our reports. We changed the distress harmonic protocols, a process that required coordination across the entire Communion fleet and took 11 standard months. Because 900 years of biological neural training does not overwrite quickly. We added the WSN pale erasure hull configuration to the archive, filling the blank entry field with what we had observed, the specific number of weapons housings, the kinetic lance engagement range, the targeting system capability, the hull material resistance data from the one tendril contact that had achieved meaningful penetration. The entry is flagged, the archive's designation for a hull type that the standard Communion engagement doctrine cannot reliably counter. It is the first such flag in 900 years of expansion. There are, as of the report I am now completing, no confirmed intelligence figures for the total number of WSN pale erasure class hulls in Wardenship service. The archive entry has a blank field where that number should be. The archive symbol for unknown quantity is a simple horizontal mark. It is the same mark used for hull counts not yet observed, for weapon systems not yet classified, for engagement durations not yet recorded. It is a neutral symbol, administrative, bloodless. The archive does not weight its unknowns. A blank hull count for a class we have seen once, and a blank hull count for a class we have never encountered, look identical in the record. I have looked at that blank field more than I can account for. Every Communion fleet in the expansion corridor uses the 14 harmonic distress cry. The Communion has 17 active expansion corridors. Each corridor has multiple fleets. Each fleet has a communications officer who has trained for 9 cycles on the correct phase stagger and amplitude for a clean distress transmission. When those officers transmit, and they will transmit, when they are struck in critical systems, because the protocol is trained past the point of conscious decision, they will give the pale erasure. Whose targeting system what we gave it. If there are more hulls of its class, they will receive it too. The blank field does not change. I look at it, and it does not change.